Yes, because we're dealing with a constitutional amendment, the process requires the legislature to pass the question or the amendment proposal in two concurrent legislatures. So the legislature that was, the ballots that are on the those proposals that are on the ballot this November was passed first in the legislature that was seated in 2019, 2020, and then again for this new term of 2021. So it has to pass two concurrent terms of the legislature, and then it would, from after that happens, it goes to the voters for their approval or denial. Well, I think the questions that are on the ballot, particularly those pertaining to the election process, are very important relative to independent redistricting, removing the 10-day requirement, and no excuse absentee voting. To jump to the independent redistricting, I have strong concerns with that. I'm opposed to that. I really believe this was really just an attempt to limit the voice of the minority party, and totally goes against what was passed by the legislature and by the voters, overwhelmingly approved by the voters in 2014, a process that was put in place to ensure minority voice in the election process. And this amendment that they're putting forward really is to try to change that, to basically put all the power in the hands of the majority party to control the redistricting process, I believe, and a lot of other people believe. In fact, two good government groups recently come out opposed to it, the League of Women Voters and Citizens Union, highlighting how this process is going to be problematic and how it does take away the voice of the minority party in the process, and then changing the rules before we even got up and started. I mean, this process, and there's a short time frame on this because, we have a independent redistricting commission right now that's holding hearings, and that process of approving that process was really put in place in 2014 to ensure that that voice of the minority party was part of that process. I'll probably talk a little bit more just to give you some background, if that's okay, because I know you take the part you need. The amendment that was passed in 2014, Tara, would require, for an amendment for the plan to pass and come to the legislature for a vote on redistricting, it would require 7 votes of the commission. But it would require, especially when the party was controlled, the Senate and the Assembly was controlled by one party, to ensure minority participation. Out of those 7 votes, 1 vote would have to come from each appointee of the minority parties. So because the Senate majority leader had 2 appointees, the Senate minority leader had 2 appointees, the Speaker had 2, and the Assembly minority leader had 2. So there's 8 members that were appointed to this board, and then those 8 put 2 other people onto the board. So to have a proposal passed the commission to come to the legislature for a vote, you would need 7 votes. But it would require 1 vote from each of those 4 blocks, the minority. And then when it went to the legislature, it would have required a 2/3 majority to approve it. But what they did now is they said, okay, you still need the 7 votes, but it doesn't have to be it doesn't have to have a vote from the Republican or the minority party in the legislature. So you could have all 4 from them, and then you could have the 2 independent, and you could have 1 of the 4, but you don't have to have 1 vote from each block. And then to approve it, again, it would be a simple majority vote, which they have an overwhelming majority, instead of having a 2/3 majority vote of the legislature. So I think as those good government groups like the League of Women Voters and Citizens Union have come out and said that this process, the process that we have, the votes that we have relative to the independent redistricting that we have in place, is the best one to go forward, not changing the rules right, weeks before the election when the maps are supposed to be put forth for actions. The same day registration, for sure, I'm adamantly opposed to. I think we have the 10-day notification requirement right now, and I think that's proper. That allows for checks and balances to verify eligibility of voters. I think really what this does create, as you said, Tara, is a same-day voting registration mechanism, and that's going to be a tremendous burden to place on our local boards of elections, with no verification of voter eligibility and how that will be monitored throughout the process. I think that could certainly lead to voter fraud and other problems, but it's certainly, again, a burden that will be placed on our local elections boards. Regarding no excuse absentee voting, I think out of the 2, this is probably the least egregious, but I think there's some concerns there that have to be addressed. And I think one of those concerns that I have is specifically regarding legislation that was passed earlier in the session that kind of would complement that that, and it's for this year, but I believe they're going to move forward with that. It's possible they will move forward with that. That will remove the requirement for a signature on an absentee ballot application, and then just allow you to call in and ask for a ballot, absentee ballot, or email in for an absentee ballot. I think the signature requirement is another verification process that should be part of this process, especially as we move forward. It's removed for this year because of COVID, but if there's talk about that continuing, I think that alone can open the door to fraud and ballot harvesting. And I just think that's something we need to look at. But I think certainly expanding the opportunity for people to vote is a good thing. But I just think there's some concerns with this that I have, and that's why I'm going to be opposing it. But I think that there needs to be more checks and balances when it comes to that process. But and we have done a lot to expand voting for people. We have 10-day early voting registration, 10-day early voting. 10 days of early voting before the election. We've made it easier for people to register to vote for this process, whether through the Department of Motor Vehicles and other processes. And I just think some of these mechanisms, particularly the same-day voting requirement, I have big concerns about. Again, there's no ability to check the verification of a registered voter, or where they are, or where they're voting, where they're coming from. And that's what the boards of elections need to do. And that can, I think, really lead to a fraud and abuse in the system. And those are some of the concerns I have on that one in particular. No, I think obviously we look at what other states do on a lot of things. I've always said with New York, we're sometimes either the first or the last to do things, and it really depends on your perspective on whether that's a good or bad thing. I think from my process, my thinking with this, as far as the process is, obviously election integrity, and with same-day voting registration, which I think removing that 10-day voter registration requirement, I don't think that's a burden to place on people. You have to be registered before the election, and that has to be able to be checked out and verified by the local boards of elections. But I think when you create a system that can create same-day voting registration with no mechanism or process in place to verify the voter registration of that person and where they're from, and if they're an eligible voter, and whether they're from that district or some other district, or that district or another state, living along the PA border. I mean, I just am concerned that this is going to open up the door for possible voter fraud. I mean, we don't want to see it. We hope that doesn't happen. I think with same-day voter registration, that certainly can happen, and possibly could happen, because we've seen it actually with the Department of Motor Vehicles and the motor voter vehicle, where we know we've had documentation when we debated that bill on the floor, especially down in Long Island, where undocumented or illegal citizens were actually on the voter registration rolls and voted, and it had to get removed from the rolls after the fact when we did the DMV motor voter laws. So I think there's a lot of issues there that need to be checked, and there's a tremendous amount of burden that's placed on our local boards of elections to monitor this and make sure things are done properly and ethically. And so, yes, we always want to continue to work to open up and encourage voting for people in the state, but we have to make sure along with that we're protecting the integrity of the election and is being done properly. Certainly, if all these amendments pass, it would certainly require legislation and regulations to follow it up to implement it, to hopefully address some of the concerns that I've raised here, but that many people have raised relative to the amendments there before the voters. Yeah, certainly that can happen. I mean, the one issue, obviously, when we're talking about the no excuse absentee voting, to ensure that there would be a requirement for a voter's signature on an actual absentee ballot application, and not just sending them a ballot because someone sent an email or a phone call came from someplace and they went through an internet portal. So I just think, yeah, and that should be the process, Tara, that after these amendments, if they are to pass, there should be a process in place and legislation to support and work out the details and the regulatory process and the framework for that to happen. I just think there's a great deal of concern out there that's been raised by people in the public and colleagues of mine as well, as far as this process, specifically, and especially when it comes to same-day voting registration, because anytime you put in place a same-day voter registration process, that definitely leads to open the door for fraud and abuse. And again, with no mechanism for local boards of elections to check on that process and verify that. So even if you put something in place, if someone's showing up at your doorstep saying we want to register to vote and vote today, with no, how do you prove that? Do you have to provide photo identification? Because there's a lot of people that don't want you to provide any type of ID if you're voting, or a photo ID when we require photo identification for other things. And that's a whole nother issue or a whole nother discussion. But the question is, for those individuals who show up at the polls on election day and say, I want to register to vote and sign out my information to vote, how do you verify that? How do you ensure that that's proper and that they're following the law and that the integrity of the election process is in place? So those are the concerns that have been raised, will continue to be raised. And I'm sure if these amendments were to pass, are going to be discussed even further as we move forward. Yes, I opposed this provision when it came before the legislature. Listen, everyone wants clean water and clean air. That's not up for discussion or debate. We don't need to put that on the ballot to ensure that or to advocate for that. The problem I have, and a number of people have, especially in the business community, is what this will do is when you say something like this is a guaranteed constitutional right, I firmly believe this opens the door for litigation and lawsuits, and New York already has its share of lawsuits on a whole host of issues, and you've seen it with other proposals that have passed earlier this year. Whether it's the Heralds Act, I think it opens up these small businesses and other businesses and others for lawsuits, and I just don't think that's where we need to be. I don't think we need to put on the ballot to say that we need clean water and clean air. Everyone wants clean water and clean air, and that is a process to do that, to ensure that we have a regulatory process with the DEC and EPA, which ensures that. But I don't think we need to put on a constitutional amendment. That I think the concern many people have, like you said, and like the other person you talked to said, it's abstract and broad, but it can certainly lead to more litigation and lawsuits. And where does that get us in the end run? I think obviously do your due diligence. There's a lot of opinions out there. Obviously, I've shared with mine. I think these amendments as a whole, and with other problems that I've seen, I'm going to be voting no because I have concerns on it relative to the independent redistricting. Again, I think it's changed what we already had in place. The voters already approved an independent redistricting process, and the one that they're going to be considering on election day is going to take away the voice of the minority party altogether. That was put in place in the other amendment to ensure that there was balance and bipartisanship in this process. And I believe the same thing on the voting registration. I think the process is in place for the safety measure and security and to ensure that there's voter integrity in this process. And I think same day voting registration, I just think leaves up too much up in the air for a chance and certainly puts an undue burden and challenge on our local boards of elections. And I think, again, with the no excuse absentee voting, I think out of the two or three, that's probably the least egregious because you can make some changes. But I'm very, very concerned, again, relative to not requiring a signature on an absentee ballot application. And we should be requiring that to show if someone wants to not be able to vote in an election or in person and be away, whether they're sick or whatever the reason is. At least at the minimum, they need to be able to have a signature on an absentee ballot application. So, but obviously, I can't stress enough to the voters to be involved, educate yourself, talk to other people about it. Elections are critical, elections matter, and it's important to make sure your voice is heard at the ballot box, whether it's for these ballot questions or whether you're voting for your local elections. And listen, local elections are right at the heart of our districts. I mean, those are your neighbors, those are the people you can knock on the door and talk to them about local issues. And I think we need to make sure people get out to vote. And we want to encourage voter participation in the process, and that's the way to do it. And then we'll continue to do that and educate people and be aware of what's going on. And please get involved, please educate yourself, and please make sure you use your voice, make sure your voice is heard, and please vote.